Hello, folks. Looks like we've got some people who are starting to join. We're going to wait just a little bit longer because we're expecting some more attendees. So we're just going to go ahead and wait for more folks to trickle in. Looks like we're still expecting just a few more, so I'm going to give it another minute or two and then we'll go ahead and kick it off. All right, looks like we've got a good critical mass of attendees. We expect some more folks might trickle in, but we want to go ahead and get started since I'm sure you're all very busy today and we're also just impatient to get started. So let's go ahead and start talking. So today, just as we get into this, we are going to set some general ground rules and expectations. We also have a slide that we're going to be sharing here. Okay, so thank you everyone for for thank you everyone for joining Enterprise Knowledge's latest installment of the Semantic Exchange. This is a webinar Ask the Expert series where we have different folks who have recently published blogs, case studies, white papers, and things like that, and we invite them to come along and walk us through their recent publications. And what's nice is we also have the chance not just to hear from them, but to also ask them questions. So the way this is going to work is Kathleen here is going to have some time to present her latest work, and then we're going to go ahead and have some time for audience questions. Now, just some general rules and expectations. We are going to facilitate the Q&A section through the chat, so there will be questions that you can submit, and then we'll go ahead and work through those as we can. Everyone will be muted and camera off, but we can invite you to unmute if we want some elaboration on your question. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Kathleen here. So Kathleen Gollner is a taxonomy consultant here at Enterprise Knowledge with over a decade of experience working on information discovery in scholarly communication, sales enablement, and knowledge management. Here at EK, she designs, implements, and manages taxonomies for a wide variety of clients and use cases, and she also guides strategies and supporting frameworks to enable search, browse, and AI-enabled solutions. So she's going to go ahead and talk to us about taxonomies versus ontologies, specifically for AI readiness. All right, Kathleen, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bonnie. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate everyone for joining today. Thanks so much. So, on the topic of taxonomies versus ontologies for AI readiness, I will cue this up. By chatting about kind of the underlying challenge or background. This sort of brings us to the question of when would you use a taxonomy versus an ontology to ground your AI solution? And the core challenge that we're dealing with here is that typically AI solutions are using AI models like LLMs that have been trained first and foremost on publicly general knowledge and then brought in-house and perhaps trained on or just pointed at the organization's internal corpus of knowledge assets. So all of the content, both structured and unstructured, as well as data sets and any other forms of records that may be useful inputs for the AI solutions. And all of those are great and wonderful inputs. The challenge that comes up is how do we reliably distill the really, really, really important things, the stuff that we never want the AI solution to get wrong, the things that are fundamental or unique to the organization. The challenges we sometimes see with AI solutions when they're working off the corpus of internal knowledge assets is they may sometimes misinterpret concepts. So for instance, misusing sales regions versus the regions in which people actually work in the organization, misusing terminology like interpreting an acronym as a more publicly known acronym as opposed to the internally used acronym, or misidentifying sources, picking up the wrong types of documents, for instance, to use as sources for certain types of answers or outputs. So the idea here is that we can use semantic models like taxonomies and ontologies to really privilege certain types of information and put them on a fast track or a more direct path for use by the AI solution. So we can do a better job of conveying those really, really important things to the AI solutions. So in this respect, we have taxonomies, which are really good at, and essentially for, codifying concepts and terminology. So what are the major organizational concepts and the terms used to talk about them within the organization? And then we have ontologies, and their core role is really codifying the relationships and rules, sort of the business logic of the organization that we may want to convey to the AI solution. So next I'm going to take a little bit of time to unpack each of these, and then we'll revisit the opening question of when to use each. So with respect to taxonomies, when we talk about a taxonomy, we're really talking about the concepts we have in the organization, putting them into sets or facets, essentially individual taxonomies of like related concepts, and then identifying how they are related to each other through hierarchies, so parent-child or broader, narrower relationships, and then also building out additional information around those concepts, so definitions, synonyms, initialisms, legacy terms, and then typically those concepts end up getting applied to knowledge assets to identify what they are, when they can be used, who can use them, any sort of tagging, essentially, of content assets or other types of assets. So as an example of how this kind of information might be leveraged within an AI solution, we could see a case where, say, an insurance rep is querying, an internal chatbot, asking for information on coverage for seepage. And seepage could be identified in our insurance claims types taxonomy as an alternative term for water intrusion. And then water intrusion is in our taxonomy listed underneath property damage. So then we have this additional context we can convey to the AI saying water intrusion is a type of property damage. More crucially, we can go narrower and identify specific types of water intrusion, say storm events versus leaking pipes, which crucially have very, very different coverage policies. So this becomes a very important piece of information to then convey to the AI to say your question about seepage actually needs to be refined to identify whether we're talking about a pipe leak or a storm event, because there are two very different coverage policies for each. So the key idea here is that the taxonomies can provide this conduit for the concepts and terminology for what really matters to the organization and how that work is conducted. So the types of taxonomies that we really see the most value for in this respect are what I call in the blog post operational taxonomies. These are things like your products list or your customers list, the things that you manage as an organization. Also, how you manage them, what kind of statuses or workflows or life cycles are associated with them, who manages them, what are the roles or business functions involved, and maybe where things happen, like regions. Conveying that kind of information to the AI through a taxonomy can help ensure that you're really helping the AI identify that critical information that's available. It's out there in your large corpus of knowledge assets that the AI can reference. But here we use our taxonomies to provide a more direct line to those really important things. So then we have ontologies. So an ontology, at its most basic, is really identifying kind of the who, what, where, when, and how of things within our organization. So where a taxonomy sort of describes the words we use and how we use them, the ontology is describing how things happen, focusing on the types of things that we want to convey to our AI solution. So here we may have entities that are um, set up to really describe what things are and the rules that govern them. So, for instance, we may have a product entity, and then with that, we can define that a product can be sold in one or more regions and not other regions specifically, and that a product may or may not be a part of a product bundle. Using those types of structures, we can then draw inferences or reason across our model. So, jumping down to my bottom of my diagram there, um, we can use the product example to make inferences that, like, if I know what products are in what product bundles and what regions each product is available in, I can infer what product bundles are available in what region and generate that additional information to help ground my AI solution. And then the middle case we see here is kind of the multi-hop situation. So maybe I don't just want to identify the product bundles, I want to go much further and I want to identify which other sales reps have sold these product bundles in this region most recently, or perhaps had the most successful sales in the last quarter. Ontologies give us that ability to stretch the source material that our AI solutions can reference. And that brings us to the really core idea of what ontologies can do for AI solutions. And that's this idea of extending or constraining organizational context based on the relationships and rules stipulated in the ontology. So the extending scenario is like the case I talked through, where we make the connection from a product bundle to specific contacts based on the data of their sales performance. Examples of constraining things may be a case where perhaps in the organization, products can only be sold by certain roles. So I shouldn't see a list of all the product bundles. I should only see the list of product bundles that I'm authorized to sell based on the products I'm authorized to sell. So I've come back to that question of taxonomies versus ontologies. The key question here becomes, what is your use case and what are your constraints? Because that will really govern or determine which of the two you choose. Although it's a false dichotomy. It's not really either or. You may be using taxonomies in isolation, but if you're doing ontologies, you're probably also doing taxonomies. Most taxonomies will have a supporting cast of taxonomies. So even in our example of the product bundles, in that situation, you're going to have at least 3 supporting taxonomies: your list of products, your list of regions, your list of product bundles. So setting aside the fact that it's not always either or, the key thing is to play to the strengths of each and make sure that you're tasking your semantic models with the right kinds of outcomes you want from your AI solutions. So on the taxonomy side, given that their real value is their ability to capture concepts and terminology, they're really good at identification and retrieval, which is core of what taxonomies have been used for a very, very long time. When you need to identify what terms are or what assets are affiliated with those concepts, taxonomies are your go-to. Taxonomies are also typically lighter weight to create and govern, so it can be kind of a good entry point. Ontologies, on the other hand, are really set up to do reasoning and inference. So those kind of scenarios we talked about where we're codifying the business logic of the organization and using that to make inferences like deducing what is product bundle I can sell in this region, or to extend further or constrain based on specific constraints or dependencies specified in my business logic. Ontologies, notably, are far more complex to develop and govern than taxonomies, so the lift there is much heavier. However, they're equipped to carry much heavier use cases as well. So, for instance, we are seeing ontologies being used for AI solutions to help with like entitlements, the ability to ensure that the AI model only surfaces certain types of information based on who can know that information, and then also for auditability, having the ability to create a very traceable and explicit path for how certain facts were arrived at by the AI solution. And on that note, kind of a quick qualifier with this discussion around how this kind of manifests in practice. So with these taxonomies and ontologies, we're not just handing them to the AI model as another knowledge asset and be like, hey, look at this. The way you articulate the architecture for an AI solution and how it interfaces with these models matters a lot. So these are operating, our taxonomies and ontologies are operating in what we call our semantic layer, where we describe the concepts and logic within the organization. Interfacing with that will be the implementation layer, where things like the AI solution lives, and the articulations between those two layers have to be set up in such a way that outcomes for things like entitlements and auditability can be achieved. But yeah, that's my quick overview of the blog with a few more detailed examples than we had in the blog post itself. I'd love to kind of open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. So, yeah, if you have any questions for Kathleen or want her to elaborate on any particular points, go ahead and pop those in the Q&A box. All right, looks like we've got one coming in. Okay, so our first question for you, Kathleen, I think it's one that a lot of us are thinking about and maybe have even already been asked in our own work. Can an AI create its own taxonomy by crawling our documents, or is the human led distillation mentioned in the blog a mandatory first step? What do you say?
Yeah, so I'll try not to get carried away with this one because I got some hot takes. Um, but I mean, technically, sure, you can use an AI to crawl your documents and distill a taxonomy or maybe a taxonomy like thing. Um, but I think if you're doing that, especially in the context that we're talking about here, where we want to leverage taxonomies to provide that more direct, explicit, these are the most important things that you absolutely cannot get wrong. If you're using an AI to generate the taxonomies for that use case, you're way too late, because the taxonomies that you need to convey that critical information are always tied to business decisions. So there's a recent blog post by Dean L. Mang called When Picklist Becomes Policy, I believe. And he talks about this a little bit. He talks about how, AI can go out there and collect terms and be like, hey, are these reasonable for a taxonomy? And then they may or may not be. But the critical thing is that it comes down to a human being making the decision of whether or not those things should be included. And those are usually business decisions. They are, we no longer create this product, or we now sell in this region and we don't anymore, or we're creating a new role for the organization that we're going to hire for. These are decisions made within the business that need to be captured in the taxonomy. So if you're waiting for your knowledge assets to kind of reflect that information such that you can distill it by an AI and generate the taxonomy, it's much too late. We typically advocate for when you develop these kinds of taxonomies, or they may already exist and you're starting to manage them formally as taxonomies for the first time. You want to tie those taxonomies in very tightly to wherever in the organization those decisions are made. So the product taxonomy should be tied very tightly with a product development cycle so that the minute the decision is effective that we no longer create this product, that can reflect in the taxonomy. And then that really highlights the value of the taxonomy for our AI solution, because now the taxonomy is the most up-to-date version of the set of products we currently sell and the things that we don't currently sell.
Great, exactly. We don't want to just develop something that's taxonomy shaped, but something that is intricately tied to the organization's own DNA and, what actually matters for the business and what use cases you're trying to resolve. Looks like we've
Yeah.
got another one. Would love for you to answer that. So, let's say an organization is starting an AI pilot today, and they have neither a taxonomy nor an ontology, no real semantic models in sight. Where should they start? Which should they build first to see the quickest return on investment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the awful answer is it depends. Because it really does come down to your use cases and what you're trying to accomplish. If you have really high stakes and you need entitlements or auditability, then you're probably looking at an ontology right out of the gate. However, if you're really just trying to, and not just because it's still a significant outcome, ground the AI better in how your organization talks about things and what matters to it, taxonomies are the sort of the first place to start. I would say as well that like the kinds of taxonomies we're talking about here, these operational taxonomies, most organizations have them already. You may not think you do because you don't currently manage them as taxonomies, but the goal with with the taxonomy side of things is really to identify what you have and begin managing it like a taxonomy and setting up those kinds of workflows and connections to decision-making processes that we talked about before. But um, but that's really a very, very powerful place to start, and much lighter lift than leaping right into an ontology. But again, it does depend on those use cases. And if the use case mandates an ontology out of the gate, then you do have to go there first.
So, related to that, another question that I'm just asking is if you're going to develop both a taxonomy and an ontology, like you need both, you're aware of that. Do you recommend doing that at the same time? Do you start with one and then do the other? Or if you're developing them in tandem, how do you make sure that both models will work together well? Anything
Yeah,
you can
that's
say
a
about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very common case, and I think it shows up in a couple different ways. Sometimes you're developing the taxonomy first, but you know the ontology is kind of hot on its tail and it's going to be quick to follow. In other cases, you may be developing them together. If it's sort of like one role doing both, or if it's two separate people. If you're two separate people, like a taxonomist and ontologist, you do have to partner extremely closely because you will need to make decisions, especially on the ontology side, throughout the design process, that will have implications for how you manage the two in tandem. I think one of the key questions that you have to answer early is what lives in a taxonomy versus the ontology, and if it lives in both, how do you manage that? Because you can quickly get into really ugly territory on the logic side of the ontology if you don't manage the demarcation between your taxonomies and ontologies very carefully. But because they work together so closely, you have to be very intentional about that. So going back to my original distinction of like those cases where if you're designing a taxonomy first, but you know the ontology is hot on its tail, you do need to kind of have it at the back of your mind that this is going to be used with an ontology and kind of remember to stay in your lane, so to speak, of what the taxonomy can do best and what you save for the ontology later on. And then if you're in the case where you're designing both at once, that you're also kind of keeping those two demarcations in mind. What does the taxonomy do best? What lives there? What does the ontology do best? What lives there? And then how the two work together.
Great, thank you for that. Another one, kind of zooming out to the bigger picture, I think, is considering a semantic grounding layer, including taxonomies and ontologies, right? What would you say are the biggest risks of launching an enterprise AI solution without any sort of semantic grounding layer?
Yeah, that's a great question because it does, I think, get to the real heart of the blog post and then this webinar. And the real to go back to kind of the opening challenge, um, when you don't have that semantic layer, you're kind of trusting, hoping that the AI can distill the really critical things from all of your knowledge assets. And that, it may do it some of the time, but the reality with a lot of AI models, particularly LLMs, is that they're inconsistent. They don't produce the same results every time. And that can be a little scary when we're talking about the things that are really, really important to the organization. So having that semantic grounding in taxonomies and ontologies gives us a way of having a very explicit, machine readable directive of these are the things that really matter to the organization and that the AI solution absolutely cannot get wrong.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And another little question. So you talked about when you were talking about taxonomies and synonyms and alternative labels and all of that. What are initialisms? I don't know that that's one I hear a lot.
Yeah, so basically an acronym is a type of initialism that you can pronounce as a word, essentially. So like ABA is an initialism, um, and then was it like YOLO? Naturally, the first one comes to mind. Would be an example of an acronym, so you can pronounce it.
Got it. Thank you for that.
That's like a very like nerdy, probably librarians only, maybe writers and content editors. Little trivia there.
Yeah, I was gonna say next time that comes up in trivia, I'll be so ready. We have a
Right.
little bit more time. If anyone has any final question, something good to end it on. Otherwise, it looks like we've gotten a lot of great information. Thank you for all of that. And also, for those of you who are attending, or for anyone who wants to share this, we are planning on sharing this recording on YouTube after we've had time to prepare it and put it into chapters and all of that. So go ahead and stay tuned if you want to have the transcript available and all of that later. Otherwise, thank you so much, Kathleen. And our
Yeah.
next
Thank you, Bonnie.
webinar, for those of you who want to check out the next installment, this is going to be on June 3rd. So keep an eye out. We'll keep posting as we have new information to share. Make sure to check out our knowledge base if you want to read any other of Kathleen Gollner's publications or any of our other semantic modeling experts. That is also a great place to keep in the loop in case you want to read instead of listen to our webinar. So thank you everyone else and hope to see you on June 3rd. And thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.